We are quite accustomed to thinking as human beings do because we are human beings. It is much more challenging, though, to try to think as God thinks, to try to discern God's will, as St. Paul urged us, to try to have our thoughts in harmony with the mind of God. We ourselves, as well as others whom we may encounter, can struggle with what Peter and the disciples are wrestling with in today's gospel. That question of the necessity of the cross for our redemption. So it's not unusual at times to hear the question raised, especially in our own day. Couldn't God, for whom nothing is supposedly impossible, have found some easier means to accomplish our salvation than to send his Son to suffer and die on a cross? But as we voice that question, whether out loud or in our own minds and hearts, let us recognize we are not thinking as God thinks, but as human beings do. Indeed, generally speaking, for us as human beings, suffering is senseless, something we try to avoid however and whenever possible. We dread any difficulties in our own lives, and we dread especially any adversity coming into the lives of those whom we know and love as well. So we keep asking, why is there suffering? And how can that suffering be of benefit or redemptive? The famous, although rather troubled artist, Vincent van Gogh, is quoted to have said, "If at times I feel myself tempted to a life of ease, I quickly find myself preferring the one of hardship. This is not the road on which one perishes." And you know how true that is. Because if we stop to think about it, some of the best gifts and virtues are most readily acquired through our experiencing adversity and even suffering, and are probably not well learned, if at all, through lives of ease and comfort that are problem-free. If we never face anything that frightens us, how could we ever learn courage? If we endure no trials that last for any length of time, this present pandemic and its restrictions a perfect example, then how would we ever grow in patient endurance? If not ever tested by troubles that could disturb us, then what is the opportunity for us to become serene? If we make no mistakes whatsoever that would ever require us to ask forgiveness, how would we ourselves then learn to be merciful? And if we face no personal failures, how do we remain or become humble? If we never have sorrows to bear, then how could we learn to be compassionate? Because if we had never faced sorrows, we wouldn't have true empathy for others who have to bear grief. Indeed, suffering is, if we allow it to be, the best of teachers in learning how to be human beings who are fully alive, deeply engaged. Now, we must take care to make an important distinction between physical pain and suffering, because physical pain from injury or illness is not a good thing at all, and if it can be controlled or eliminated medically, it absolutely should be. But suffering is not physical pain. It's predominantly mental, emotional, and spiritual, because unlike animals, who also experience pain as we do, they are not capable of suffering as we do, because they have no capacity to be reflective and ask the question, why? Why is this happening? How is it fair? In that lies the ultimate human capacity for suffering, and the only true antidote for it is a hopeful and trusting faith. for there usually aren't satisfactory answers to be found in the midst of suffering. And so suffering is the way to test and thus to grow in that kind of trustful faith. We will grow in such faith as we realize we should not be asking why. We should not, because if the most perfect human being who ever lived, the wisest, most just, humble, patient, kind, loving, compassionate, and merciful Jesus went to a cross and endured not only terrible physical pain, but also great mental anguish and spiritual suffering in order to save us, then who are we in the end to ask, why me, when merely a fraction of what Jesus endured ever comes our way? Rather, when we suffer, we should try to think as God thinks. Thus we should do as Jesus did, which is to surrender ourselves wholly to God and trust. And as the scriptures assure us, by patient endurance, we will preserve our lives. Not lives of comfort and ease to which many aspire in this world, but rather the true and unending life won for us by Jesus Christ through his suffering, death, and resurrection. Life that is ours only through faith, thus a life that is in danger of loss mainly through doubt, despair, and disbelief, to which we are most tempted, ironically, by suffering itself. So in whatever various forms it may appear, let us take up the cross and follow Jesus Christ in faith, perhaps losing our lives as we hoped them to be or imagined them to be in this world, if we must, but preserving that gift of true life that Jesus alone offers, the one that will last forever. Good thing we're found in church.